Good day. My name is Stephen Mock, and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Adams County Historical Society. Also, and in light of today's topic, I've been a proud member of a George Armstrong Custer and Little Bighorn study group. This group has spent many solid hours studying the man and the legend, who even today can bring a visceral reaction from the population. George Custer has been one of the most compelling, yet controversial characters in American history. He was the boy general in the American Civil War. He was active here at the Battle of Gettysburg, and even was considered a hero at the time of General Robert E. Lee's surrender. However, George Custer is probably best remembered for his last stand fight, in which he and most of his command were annihilated by a combined force of Native American tribes at the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Even to today, Custer, the soldier and the man, can breed controversy. Here at the Adams County Historical Society, we are honored today to be able to present to you an expert on both the American West and on General George Custer. Dr. Judy Morley is an historian and a Gettysburg entrepreneur who has agreed to share her expertise with us. Dr. Morley holds multiple degrees, including a PhD. She has previously served as Director of Development for the Western History Association, where she developed a fascination with the interplay of myth and reality in the American West. Dr. Morley has authored several articles about the American West and has been the lead scholar on 3 historical documentaries. After today, Dr. Morley, you can list that as 4 lead historians on a documentary. Without further ado, I would bring you all Dr. Morley, and Judy, as a lead-in question, I would just ask, how did you develop your interest in George Custer, the man, the myth, and the legend?
The thing that got me interested in Custer is that I'm fascinated with the American West, and I'm fascinated mainly with the American West as myth. In many ways, the story of the American West is the kind of mythic foundational story of the United States. It's our creation myth, how we conquered this empty wilderness and how, which wasn't of course really empty, and U.S. came to be with manifest destiny, and this mythic identity of the United States has just always fascinated me. And so there aren't very many people who contributed to that mythic identity like George Armstrong Custer. So I'm originally from the West. My PhD is in American history, but it's actually in the history of the American West and how the Western patterns of development and patterns of society differ from Eastern patterns of development. And certainly Custer is one of those people that you have to look at if you're looking at what it means to be an American and what it means to be a Westerner. And so that mythic component and Custer as symbol is what got me interested in him. And then when I dug in a little deeper and learned more about his life and just saw the bundle of contradictions that he is in life, then it just became almost a fascinating psychological study. So that got me interested. And then, of course, I moved, being originally from Colorado, I moved from Denver to Gettysburg, where Custer plays such an important role. So he just seems to be this theme throughout my life.
Dr. Morley, thank you. This is going to be fascinating.
So the title of this presentation is George Armstrong Custer, the General We Love to Hate. I don't know if there are many more divisive figures in history than George Custer. And I think he's divisive because he is so much a man of his time. And yet, he's an anachronism in many ways, even in his own time. So what do I mean by that? Custer was a perfect foil for the 19th century. He was someone who lived his life in an antebellum way, even as the war itself became the thing that brought him fame and notoriety. And so over the generations since Custer lived and, of course, died heroically, some would say tragically, some would say infamously, some would say on the Little Bighorn battlefield, he has been a controversial figure. So who was Custer? And more importantly, why should we care? Custer is definitely seen, especially in the early 21st century, as a martyr to the idea of manifest destiny. He was someone who was symbolic of the United States coming of age, had his own coming of age story that paralleled that of the nation. And yet he was so contradictory because his own birth and death bookended one of the most profound times of change in U.S. history. His death at the Little Bighorn was the death knell of the agrarian provincial culture that he so symbolized, and yet he never could adapt to the organizational industrial culture that he helped usher in. And I think that's why he is still such a symbol. So Custer the man really doesn't have a very noteworthy birth or beginning. He's born in New Rumley, Ohio, to working class parents. His father, Emanuel Custer, was a blacksmith, an uneducated blacksmith. He was a Jacksonian Democrat and evangelical Christian who was taken by the Second Great Awakening. Custer's mother was Emanuel's second wife, and she had 2 children from a prior marriage. She was a widow when she married Emanuel. And the only reason that's important is that her older daughter, Lydia Ann, became one of Custer's patrons and confidants. It is Lydia Ann who moved to Monroe, Michigan from New Rumley, Ohio, and that is where Custer gets his association with Michigan. And in many ways, his older half-sister, Lydia Ann, becomes kind of a surrogate mother figure to young George Armstrong Custer. Now, he was not called George in his lifetime. He was called Armstrong or Audie. Audie came from the fact he couldn't pronounce his middle name, Armstrong, so he called himself Audie, and that became his nickname. Custer goes to West Point in 1857. He sees it as really the only way that he can get a professional education. He knows that his parents are not in a position to give it to him. The pictures on the screen show him in his cadet uniform as a very young man. He gets appointed from Ohio and joins in 1857 to be part of the class of 1861. He does indeed graduate in 1861 by the skin of his teeth, but he's delayed, unlike all of his other comrades who go off to the Civil War right after graduation, because remember, the Civil War starts in April of 1861, and Custer's graduating with his class in May of 1861, but Custer does not go off to fight the Civil War. Why? Because of an incident that causes him to be court-martialed. He is not even out of West Point yet. He has graduated dead last in his class, 34th out of 34. And he gets into an altercation, or more importantly, he allows an altercation between 2 cadets when he was supposed to be on guard duty. And this leads to a court-martial. He is convicted in the court-martial, but they offer no punishment because of the timing. Because here we are, the beginning of the Civil War. West Point needs all the graduates it can get to go out and lead men. And so Second Lieutenant Armstrong Custer gets convicted in the court-martial with no punishment and joins the United States Army just in time for the Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. Now, the Civil War in many ways epitomizes Custer's career. I call this part of his life Custer the Hero. During the Civil War, Custer establishes himself as a bona fide hero. Doesn't matter what we think of him today, you have to look back at him during the Civil War years and see that in many ways he is so responsible for shaping the Army, shaping the role of the cavalry, and bringing about this heroic image, this cavalier image, almost an overly romanticized image. As I said, he is an anachronism. Custer is a man not of his time, but of a previous time. So in this organization called the U.S. Army that is now built on industrialized principles and organizational discipline and the precursor of the modern corporate culture, Custer is an individualist who wants to lead saber charges and wear red sashes and do heroic individualistic things. So he is a complete anachronism, and yet it is that very anachronistic aspect of him that makes him a hero during the Civil War. Almost immediately when he joins the Army of the Potomac, he joins General McClellan's staff. General George B. McClellan is the commander-in-chief of the Army at this point. He's a Democrat, as is Custer, in an otherwise Republican administration. And so Custer finds a like-minded soul in McClellan. Custer himself, even though he's from Ohio and then later gets his appointment from the state of Michigan because of ties to his older half-sister, he definitely has Southern sympathies. That's part of being a member of the Democratic Party in the era. It's also the fact that Custer, down to his toenails, is a racist. He doesn't believe that blacks are his equal. He does not believe that this war is being fought for states' rights. And honestly, my personal opinion is if you asked George Custer in 1861 why he was fighting the Civil War, his answer would have been all about himself and establishing himself and getting glory and getting the respect of his fellow soldiers, and not really anything to do with the politics or the grander causes of the Civil War. However, he fit in nicely with McClellan's command because of his Southern sympathies and the Copperhead view that he has. He is protected and promoted by George McClellan, and he finds a patron in the head of the cavalry, Alfred Pleasanton. And all of this allows him to keep his Southern sympathies for the first part of the Civil War, at least through 1861 and into 1862. Custer first comes to prominence in the Peninsula Campaign, where he is able to assist in several of the battles on the Peninsula Campaign. He comes to the attention of not only McClellan, but Winfield Scott Hancock and several others who are absolutely taken by this very brash young man. But he never lets go of those Southern sympathies. In the picture on the screen, in the upper left, you see Custer with a captured Confederate soldier who happened to be one of his buddies from West Point. And so Custer insists that this soldier, before he gets shipped off to a prison camp, poses for a picture with Custer. So there the two of them are in their picture together, and Custer sees absolutely nothing anomalous about this, about having his picture taken with a Confederate who happens to be his friend. About this same time, in the bottom picture, you see Custer as part of McClellan's staff. Custer is the figure all the way to the far right. Obviously, you see Abraham Lincoln. McClellan is the short man facing Lincoln. The rest of the men in the picture are the other soldiers on McClellan's staff, with Custer, the cavalier, in his slouch hat all the way to the right. So this is Custer in his contradictions. He's a Southern sympathizer at the same time that he's there having access to the highest levels of both political and military power. This changes right before Gettysburg. You know, McClellan is removed as commander of the Army in 1862, followed by Ambrose Burnside and then Joseph Hooker. Custer finds a place in this new order thanks to his patron, Alfred Pleasanton, who is the head of cavalry and who appreciates Custer. But Custer hasn't had any real success on the battlefield. He's done some good things. He's come to the attention of people, but nothing stunning until Gettysburg. And it is at Gettysburg that Custer makes a name for himself. In June of 1863, at the tender age of 22, George Custer is promoted to a brigadier general, and he leads the 2nd Brigade, the 3rd Division of U.S. Cavalry under Judson Kilpatrick here at Gettysburg. And it is this Michigan brigade that leads him to glory here, or the beginnings of glory in the Civil War. This brigade fights at the Battle of Hunterstown on July 2nd here during the Gettysburg Campaign. And then, of course, he is honored at East Cavalry Field here in Gettysburg for saving the rear of the Union Army against attacks led by, of course, J.E.B. Stuart and Wade Hampton. So Custer makes a name for himself. It's not that Custer is in command. Custer's reporting to David Gregg, who then reports up to Pleasanton, who then reports up to Meade. Custer is a low-level commander here. He is a middle manager, if you will. But he makes a name for himself because he leads the one thing that is not done very much in the Civil War, and that is a daring saber charge on horseback at East Cavalry Field. It is such an anachronism, it is such an anomaly that it becomes famous almost immediately. Custer continues to fight through the rest of the Gettysburg Campaign. He is integral in the retreat of Lee back across the Potomac. He fights at the battles of Monterey Gap and Falling Waters and makes a real name for himself nationally. He is mentioned in the newspapers. It is not just his superiors in the Army who are noticing him now. It is civilian authorities and political patrons who are taking notice of Custer. Custer takes leave of absence in February of 1864 to go back to Monroe, Michigan, to court and marry one Libby Bacon. We will talk more about Elizabeth Bacon Custer when we talk about Custer's personal life. But Libby Bacon was the daughter of a well-respected Republican judge back in Monroe, Michigan. Custer wins her heart, although through some disingenuous means, but he does win her heart, and they marry in February of 1864. And Libby then comes with Custer, goes on campaign with him, and really becomes the professional Mrs. General Custer. That is her entire identity. Custer and Libby return back in Washington after their marriage at the same time as Ulysses S. Grant. You cannot imagine from a Civil War perspective two more opposite people as Grant and Custer. Grant is unassuming. He doesn't want to draw attention to himself. He doesn't want to ask his soldiers to do anything he won't do. He's very good at the day-to-day management of his army. He is definitely what we would call in the 20th century a company man. He knows how to get things done. He doesn't believe in glory for himself. He's not showy. And I always love the picture of Grant riding in the same railroad car as Libby and Armstrong Custer as they arrive in Washington, D.C., because Armstrong is flashy and wanting praise, so insecure that he is desiring the notice of everyone. Everything he does is to get attention. He is definitely flashy. And the two of them make such a great dichotomy that I think that would have been one of those historical moments of time where you just want to be there in that railroad car watching those two arrive in Washington. And in many ways, one represents the future of the United States in Grant, and one represents the past in Armstrong. Armstrong's time is ending. This heroic cavalier romantic notion is not going to live into the latter part of the 19th century. And Grant's more solid, less individualistic, more organizational persona is going to be the way of the future. Throughout 1864, Custer makes a name for himself in the cavalry under Phil Sheridan. Once Grant takes over as the general of all the armies, he puts Phil Sheridan in charge of the cavalry. Sheridan becomes another one of Custer's patrons, just like Sheridan's predecessor, Alfred Pleasanton. At the Battle of Trevilian Station in June of 1864, there's a little foreshadowing there of Little Bighorn, where Custer goes dashing into a fight without knowing all of the conditions. He doesn't really look at what's in front of him. He goes dashing off into the fight, loses his wagon train, loses part of his command, loses his personal belongings, including private letters from his wife, Libby, and he is surrounded. And he and his men have to hold out for 3 hours until finally the rest of the cavalry can come and rescue him. Some historians call Trevilian Station Custer's first stand or Custer's first last stand, but it shows his recklessness when he gets in the heat of battle. But other than Trevilian Station, Custer does a brilliant job on the Shenandoah campaign with Phil Sheridan. He is dependable. It is his command that ends up assassinating or killing, I guess you wouldn't call it assassinating because he's killed in battle, but he kills cavalry commander of the Confederates, Jeb Stuart, at the Battle of Yellow Tavern in May of 1864. It is Custer who's integral to defeating Jubal Early's Confederates in the Shenandoah Valley, and it is Custer who is the linchpin to the battles of Third Winchester and Cedar Creek, which basically assure a Union victory in the Shenandoah Valley and take the Confederates off the map there. Custer then returns to duty around Petersburg as the siege of Petersburg continues through the Civil War, and his command is vital in cutting off the retreat of Robert E. Lee to Appomattox Courthouse. Custer does do something that's very characteristic of him. As Lee's army is retreating to Appomattox Courthouse, and it's clear that they have no option except to surrender, Custer, under a flag of truce, goes into General James Longstreet's camp and demands that Longstreet surrenders. And Longstreet kind of looks at this brash young Union cavalry commander and says, basically, neither one of us have the authority to end this war. I'm not going to surrender to you, and you don't even have the authority to ask. And I believe that Generals Grant and Lee are meeting right now as we speak, so let's let them work it out. But that definitely is symbolic of Custer's arrogance and his belief that he can overstep his boundaries and not really see many repercussions. But of course, while that is going on, Grant is indeed writing up terms for General Lee in the McLean's front room. They sign the agreement, and at that moment, the main army of the Confederacy under Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th, 1865. Now, during this time of campaigning in 1864, General Phil Sheridan has become so enamored of not only Armstrong, but his wife Libby, that Sheridan wants to send Libby a gift. Sheridan is a bachelor, but he's awkward by most accounts, but he definitely feels at ease with Libby Custer. And so as a gift, Sheridan purchases the table on which Grant and Lee sign the surrender. He purchases it from its owner, Wilmer McLean, and sends it as a gift to Libby Custer, saying, "No one has had a greater role in the coming of this surrender than your husband." Libby Custer is delighted with the gift. It now resides in the Smithsonian Institution. During the Civil War, then, Custer definitely plays the role of the hero. He gets things done. One place where he and Grant are alike is they fight. That was one of Abraham Lincoln's biggest problems with every general up until Grant, is their reluctance to engage in battle. But U.S. Grant has no compunction about it, and neither does General Custer. He is willing to go into a fight. He has personal bravery. He leads from the front. His men will fight for him because he treats them well, and he shows that he is not going to ask them to take any risks that he himself is not willing to take. In many ways, this is the epitome of Custer's career. It's not what we remember him for, but it's the epitome of his career because everything about the Civil War feeds Custer's personality. It feeds his deep-rooted need for attention. It feeds his desire to be someone great. It feeds his need for patronage and to be accepted by his peers and his superiors. And he gets all of that on the battlefield. Unfortunately, Custer does not know how to not be on the battlefield, which leads to the Custer of the post-Civil War period. And I've titled this section, Custer the Villain. So we have Custer the hero during the Civil War, but now we have Custer the way we remember him most, and that is Custer the Villain and his time in the West. If you look at what's happening in American culture at this time, American culture at the end of the Civil War has made its shift. The romantic sort of beau geste ideal of an aristocratic agrarian nation that was really epitomized by the slave system in the South, but certainly held sway in areas of the Midwest as well in the antebellum period prior to the Civil War, has been defeated. And what you get now in the post-war period is the victory not only of the Union and not only of freedom, but also of a new world order built on industrialization, built on mechanization, built on the corporate structure that is pioneered by the United States Army during the Civil War. And Custer, this rampant individualist, does not fit into this new culture. And yet he was so integral in bringing it to bear. But he does not fit. Without the opportunity to distinguish himself on the battlefield, he himself is lost and doesn't really know his place. He struggles in the immediate post-war period. As soon as the surrender is signed at Appomattox and the war comes to an official end, Custer is sent to Texas to try to put down the last of the rebellion there. In this role, he does not have to be the gallant leader, but rather a really good manager. And Custer can't do it. He does not know how to navigate this political landscape. First, at the end of the Civil War, 10 days after the surrender at Appomattox, prior to him going west, Custer steals a horse. He finds a beautiful racehorse named Don Juan, owned by a Virginia planter. The Virginia planter had committed no atrocities against the Union. The war was over. There was no military or legal reason for Custer to take this horse except that Custer wanted it, and Custer steals it. He gets all of the pedigree, he takes it, and he basically hides it away back in Michigan. The planter comes and asks for it, and Grant tells him to return it. Unfortunately, Phil Sheridan protects Custer. Custer keeps the horse. But it's the first time we see Custer's kind of personality come out, that he's not in it for the good of the cause so much as he's in it for the good of Custer. Then when he's assigned to Texas during Reconstruction, he does not know how to discipline his men. He turns into a mini tyrant. He punishes men for minor infractions. He has absolutely no conception that these men are not regular army. They are volunteers who came to fight the war, to fight for freedom and to fight for the Union, which in their estimation has been achieved. Now for 3 years they have neglected home and family in order to fight for the Union cause, which has been won. They want to go home. They don't appreciate being assigned to Texas, and they really don't appreciate the deprivations that come with that. No food, harsh discipline, terrain that is unfamiliar and unforgiving. And instead of working in a leadership capacity here, Custer comes down in a punitive way. When they appropriate food from civilians because they're hungry, he has them lashed or shaves their heads to embarrass them. He has them shot for desertion. He is complained about all the way up the ranks until finally he is relieved of command when the Civil War era army is disbanded, and this time during Reconstruction is given over to civil authorities. For the rest of 1865 then and all of 1866, Custer kind of flounders. He doesn't know who he is without the army. He is not politically savvy whatsoever. He agrees with President Andrew Johnson, who takes over after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Most Republicans had embraced Andrew Johnson because they believed that he would bring balance to the ticket with Lincoln in 1864. However, once Johnson becomes president, he shows his true colors as a staunch Democrat and someone who wants to reinstate the old racial hierarchy of the South. Really, the only one that Andrew Johnson wants to make pay for the Civil War were the very wealthiest of planters who Johnson felt oppressed him as a middle-class Southerner. But Johnson does not believe that there is anything the federal government should do for the freed African-American slaves, the freedmen. He does not believe that there should be any prohibition against former Confederates holding state office in Southern states. And trying to gain support for some of Andrew Johnson's laws, Johnson invites the military hierarchy to go on a campaign trip with him, basically, in early 1866, prior to the midterm elections, hoping to get support for this more conservative approach to the future of the United States. If the Republicans, with their abolitionist ideas and their belief that the freedmen should be given equal rights, were seen as radicals, then certainly Johnson was seen as the opposite end of that spectrum, as a conservative. Johnson has Secretary of State Seward, Secretary of War Stanton, Ulysses S. Grant, and George Custer, among others, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, go with him on what they called a swing around the circle, a campaign trip that devolved from a respectable campaign trip to frequent shouting matches between Andrew Johnson and the public to whom he spoke, who saw Johnson's policies as being contrary to everything the war had just been fought for. Reinstating the Southern slaveholders to positions of power, not doing anything to protect the freedom of the freedmen. While Grant became disgusted with it, and Seward became disgusted with it, and Gideon Welles withdrew, Custer continued with Johnson, frequently got into shouting matches on Johnson's behalf, and showed his true colors. This hurt Armstrong. This hurt him badly because Armstrong was still waiting for a regular promotion in the U.S. Army. His promotion to Major General had been Major General of the U.S. Volunteers, which was only in effect as long as there was a volunteer army during the Civil War. But once 1865 rolled around and the volunteer army had been disbanded, Custer needed an appointment by Congress to go from being a captain to being anything higher. And by joining Andrew Johnson's swing around the circle, he hurts himself. And he has to play a lot of political catch-up to try to explain his actions and explain his ideas, which makes him basically revert to just lying. He just lies and says he was misinterpreted. He was taken out of context. You know, things people in politics still say. He had to justify all of these missteps. He was very much lost in this post-war period. By the end of 1866, he is given command as a lieutenant colonel. He's given command of the newly formed 7th U.S. Cavalry, and he's sent out to Fort Riley, Kansas, to try to keep the peace among the Indian nations that are now starting to increase warfare after the Civil War. There had been some activity during the Civil War with the Plains tribes, but not that much, mainly because U.S. expansion to the west had been thwarted because of the Civil War. Nobody was really moving west. They were all focused on what was going on during the Civil War. But in 1862, there was an uprising of the Lakotas in Minnesota, and in 1864 in southern Colorado, there was a massacre of the Arapahoes and the Cheyennes at a place called Sand Creek. That had put the Plains Indians on high alert. And now, after the Civil War, as we see an increase in westward expansion from all sections of the United States, people in the north looking for opportunity, people from the Midwest coming west because of the gold rushes, people from the south trying to leave burned out plantations and a devastated economy, and freed slaves trying to seek better opportunity. This influx of population leads to more and more conflict with the Indian tribes. And so Custer goes west to Fort Riley, Kansas, and in 1867, he becomes an agent for the government and accompanies Winfield Scott Hancock in his campaign against the Cheyenne Indians starting in 1867. On the screen, you see some of the pictures of Custer from this era, particularly the one in the lower right, which is Custer with some of his Crow Scouts from this 1867 to 1870 time period. Well, after the 1867 campaign with Hancock, where Custer and Hancock are able to bring the majority of the Arapahoes and Southern Cheyennes into the reservation in Oklahoma. Custer goes AWOL. He decides that he's having trouble with his wife, Libby. Libby and Custer, when you read their correspondence, and they left volumes of correspondence. We know more about this relationship than practically any other relationship because they left volumes. And you know that they were unedited because these volumes have risque references. They have sometimes downright disturbing sexual references in them. So we know that they were an unedited collection. But there's a period where after writing to one another almost daily throughout the Civil War and then picking up again in the later 1860s, from late 1866 into early 1867, Custer and Libby don't write to one another for months. They don't see one another. Custer is in Washington while Libby's already gone to Kansas. And then when Custer finally arrives at Fort Riley, Kansas, Libby goes to New York. Well, we don't know what happened. Historians have conjectured that perhaps Custer, who probably had many affairs in his life, never enough to get caught or have hard evidence of, but probably had many affairs. We don't know if perhaps he did get caught by Libby and that's what caused it. We don't know. There's been a lot of conjecture, but no historical evidence of what happened between them during this time period. But while he was out on campaign with Whitfield Scott Hancock against the Cheyennes and Arapahoes, he decides he misses Libby, something has gone wrong, and he basically goes AWOL, leaving his camp in the field to get back to Fort Riley to see Libby. While doing so, he leaves a portion of his command behind who are ambushed by Arapahoes and Cheyennes who are not on the reservation and killed. And Custer does not go to find their bodies, retrieve them, or bury them. He commandeers a horse, several horses actually, and rides them hard enough that they have to be retired when they get to Fort Riley. So he commandeers government property to go see Libby and takes with him two of his staff members without paying them through the government, not paying them personally, to accompany him to see Libby. He is arrested in August and brought up on court-martial charges, of course, for being AWOL, and is found guilty in October of 1867 and is suspended in both rank and pay for 1 year. This, in many ways, is the epitome of Custer's struggles after the Civil War. Where is his place when you cannot gallantly charge against a formidable foe or a worthy foe, which Custer never found the Indians a worthy foe? If you can't charge against them, what do you do? In many ways, it shows Custer's idea, too, that the law may not apply to him. And while I am no psychologist, I do think that Custer was someone who had trouble understanding the consequences of his actions. I think that he couldn't think them through. Historians have talked for decades about something called Custer luck, the luck that in his first court-martial at the end of his time at West Point, the war started and he was needed at the front, so it kept him from having any consequences. The luck that he could be grazed by bullets time and time again in a number of Civil War battles, but never struck enough that he actually got sick or ever got wounded. The luck that he would get sick with things that killed other soldiers, like dysentery, but never got sick enough for it to relieve him from command. So Custer's luck was already legendary, but here in this court-martial in 1867 and his suspension, it feels like his luck has run out. But no, he has a patron. Custer's patron is Phil Sheridan, who has now taken command of all the armies of the West, who is in charge of the armies in Indian affairs, and Sheridan decides in the summer of 1868 that he wants to lead a winter campaign in 1868-1869 against the Arapahoes and Cheyennes that will not stay on the reservation. They've gone there, but there are bands that will not stay there. That was one of the problems with the Indian Wars always. There was no unified central government of an Indian tribe. And so family bands or bands of kin relationships would leave, not thinking they were breaking the law. They went to hunt. They intended to come back. But of course, the U.S. Army didn't see it that way. So Sheridan decides that there will be a campaign against the Arapahoes and Cheyennes in 1868. Custer is the one he chooses to lead it. So he brings Custer back from his year-long suspension 2 months early. Custer only serves 10 months of his suspension. He's reinstated to both pay and rank, comes back as a lieutenant colonel, and leads the 7th Cavalry against what becomes known as the Battle of the Washita in Oklahoma. During this attack, Custer finds the village of Black Kettle on the banks of the Washita River, attacks at dawn with no warning and no provocation. The camp is asleep. There is not a line of warriors arrayed out there against him. They are asleep in their tents. Custer attacks, a surprise attack, splits his command, and half goes around behind the camp because Custer's perception of Indians is that they will run away. That has been his experience in the campaigns he's had so far, particularly in 1867 with Winfield Scott Hancock, that just before you can attack them, they will run away. And so Custer's trying to keep them from running away. According to Custer's report, he attacks, he claims that he kills 103 warriors and takes 53 women and children as prisoners. Indian accounts say that 11 warriors were killed, and everyone else who was killed of that number were non-combatant women, children, and old men. Regardless, they were sent to Fort Hays, Kansas as prisoners. This echoes the Sand Creek Massacre that had happened 4 years earlier in Colorado. There's still a pretty lively historical debate about whether Washita was a massacre or a battle. In Sand Creek, the National Park Service has commemorated the site of the Sand Creek Massacre as such. It is called officially the Sand Creek Massacre. The Park Service still commemorates the site of the Battle of the Washita, calling it a battle. Were the Indians actual combatants? Was Custer justified in this surprise attack? That is still, as I said, a very open question in, the early 21st century. However, it definitely shows, more important to my point as Custer the Villain, it definitely shows Custer's mindset here, that he's more afraid about capturing and killing these people before they can get away than he is about the honor and glory that so marked his days as the gallant cavalier during the Civil War. It's almost like he's a different man. But it's not. He is not a different man. He is up against a different foe. And the foe tests his opinions of anyone who is not like him. It shows all of Custer's racial prejudices, making him in many ways a man of his time, but more and more a man out of time, because these sorts of racial prejudices are declining in the North and in the West. While they hold on in the South for a very long time, they are no longer the official policy of the United States, and they are becoming less and less popular. However, in 1868, Custer is seen as the hero at the Battle of the Washita, gets Black Kettle and his band to go to the reservation. Custer continues to be a celebrity. He continues to bank on his celebrity of the Civil War. During this time period, you also have a variety of writers coming west to write for Harper's Weekly, to write dime novels, to write about the exploits of some of these heroes. You have men who get written about during their lifetime who become dime novel staples, including Custer, including Wild Bill Hickok, including Buffalo Bill. And these men are being trailed by writers who take any little kernel of heroicism and blow it out of proportion into this grand narrative that helps to build the myth of the American West and the myth of manifest destiny and the glorious conquest of this land. Well, to that end, Custer is asked in 1872 to accompany a grand hunting expedition with the Grand Duke of Russia, Duke Alexei Romanov. So Grand Duke Alexei travels here for his 22nd birthday. he sees the East Coast. He meets with General Grant. He sees a lot of the United States. He goes to the reconstructing South. But what he wants to do on his 22nd birthday is go on a buffalo hunt. So the picture in the very center of this screen, you see the party that is in the buffalo hunt here. Right in the center, seated on the couch, is Grand Duke Alexei, and to his immediate right, your left, is General Phil Sheridan. But in the middle row, seated on the far right, is Armstrong Custer. And Custer is named the Grand Marshal of the hunt. And the picture you see in the upper left corner is the picture that he had taken specifically for the press around this hunt. And so throughout 1872, Custer leaves his command with the sanction of the army, because Sheridan also leaves his command, to take this diplomatic mission, if you will, with Grand Duke Alexei Romanov, hunting for buffalo in the West. And it is a media sensation, making Custer once again a hero. In 1873, Custer and the 7th Cavalry are seen going to the Black Hills to protect a railroad surveying party that wants to build a railroad through the northern states to get to the new opening territories up, what will become Washington State and Oregon. During that, there is a lot of pushback from the Lakota, the Sioux Nation. The Black Hills is sacred to them. That is their sacred ground. It has been for centuries. By the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, they had been promised that they would never have to cede that land, that would be theirs as long as the sun shall rise and the rivers shall flow. But unfortunately, this railroad's being built through in 1873, 1874, and worst of all, while the railroad party and the 7th Cavalry are there, they find gold. And this sparks the Black Hills Gold Rush. Officially, the U.S. position is to try to keep the white gold seekers out of the area, but they soon realize that that is never going to happen. That is a failing proposition, and they try to buy the Black Hills from the Lakota. They offer probably not a fair price, but they do offer to pay for it. And the Lakotas say no. This is what sets off the Great Sioux War of 1876-1877, is this rush of gold. During the Great Sioux War now, the various tribes, the various bands of the Lakota and their allies, the Northern Cheyenne, come together to try to figure out a strategy for how they can win. 10 years earlier, a Lakota chief named Red Cloud had actually opposed the building of forts up through Wyoming in what was known as Red Cloud's War. The chief was Chief Red Cloud, and from 1866 to 1868, Red Cloud's War actually caused the U.S. government to abandon building forts through what is today central Wyoming because the Lakota were so fierce in their opposition. Now, 10 years later, a variety of bands, including the Oglala and the Hunkpapa Lakota, come together to try to strategize a way that they can repeat Red Cloud's success, to try to keep their sacred ground of the Black Hills free from the influx of gold seekers, and to try to keep their hunting grounds through what is today Montana and the Bighorn Valley free from settlers. It is in the midst of this that Custer finds himself called back to Washington. Not the place Armstrong Custer wants to be. Custer wants to be out there fighting Indians. But in the midst of all this, there is an investigation going on in Congress of corruption in the military. They are investigating Grant's Secretary of War, who is now president, by the way. U.S. Grant is now by 1876 president. His Secretary of War, William Belknap, has been accused of corruption, and so has Grant's brother, Orville Grant. They have been seen as bilking government contractors and bilking the government by allowing contractors to have contracts that they pay and then goods never arrive. Most of the people who are affected by this corruption are the Indians, where the federal government purchases things like blankets and beef for the Indian reservations, and they never show up at the Indian reservations. Or the beef that they pay that the government pays top dollar for shows up, and it is wormy and rancid and rotted. And so that's the corruption that they are looking into. because of Custer's presence on the West, because of Custer's need to set up all these supply depots, and because of his interface with the War Department providing for these reservations, he is called to testify in this trial before Congress. Ever politically tone deaf, Custer goes back to Washington and, in the course of his testimony, furthers some unfounded accusations against both Belknap and Orville Grant. Now, Custer was never one of General Grant's darlings. Grant put up with him because Grant respected Sheridan and Sheridan protected Custer. But now as president, Grant is not amused by Custer's unfounded accusations. Custer finds himself being praised by the Democratic press, who are in many ways leading the charge on this politically motivated investigation of corruption. And Custer plays to the Democratic press. At one point, the Democratic press even suggests that maybe Custer run for president in 1876. You can just imagine how someone who has a penchant for the kind of attention that Armstrong Custer has, how that would land with him. I mean, he is, starry-eyed at the whole idea. But he's kind of tired of politics, and he's done his testimony, and he's ready to go back. He knows that things are brewing on the Northern Plains. He knows that the Lakota are in the midst of an uprising. He is ready to get back. He asks to be excused, and Grant says no. He has to stay in Washington. He has not completed his testimony. He may need to be cross-examined. He needs to stay. This is in April of 1876. Grant is trying to find a way to discredit Custer and his testimony, and Custer gets tired of waiting. After 3 weeks of waiting in Washington, Custer realizes he hasn't heard anything from Congress or Grant, so he gets on a train to go back west. Without orders, he just leaves. Grant is livid. He orders Sherman, who is General-in-Chief of the Army at this point, William Tecumseh Sherman, to have Custer arrested in Chicago when Custer goes to change trains. Custer's arrested in Chicago, acts like he has no idea what he has done wrong, and finally Sheridan intercedes on Custer's behalf, tells Grant he definitely needs him out west. Grant agrees, but says that Custer cannot lead any campaign with the 7th Cavalry. He must report to General Alfred Terry, who is at Fort Abraham Lincoln. Well, it's better than nothing. So Custer arrives at Fort Abraham Lincoln in May of 1876 to campaign against the Lakotas. He coordinates with Terry. Terry's coming up from the south. Custer's to attack from the east. Custer gets word that perhaps the largest number of Native Americans ever camped on the North American continent are gathering, and all Custer can do is get excited to go find them. On June 15, 1876, a member of the 7th Cavalry, Major Marcus Reno, discovers a large camp of Indians on the Rosebud River, reports this to both Custer and Terry, says that this is big, folks. Reno's reports are not, this is your garden variety big camp. This is the largest camp anyone's ever seen. Rather than wait to rendezvous with Terry and get reinforcements, Custer, of course, splits his command. He has Reno attack from the creek on the southwest, another commander, Frederick Benteen, attack from the south, while, just like at the Battle of Washita, just like at the cavalry battle at Trevilian Station in 1864, Custer rides around the back to try to keep the Indians from getting away. And that's the end of Custer. The Lakota rise up at that point. Custer is far outnumbered, and the portion of the 7th Cavalry that rides with Custer is all killed at the Little Bighorn in what becomes known as Custer's Last Stand. So we all know that part of Custer. Let's talk now a little bit about his personal life and the contradiction that he is, that makes him such an anomaly, that makes him such a villain, if you will. I said I'd talk more about his marriage to Libby Bacon. Custer, you see up in the upper left, is married to Elizabeth Bacon. They are, by all accounts, happily wed, except they never have children. Most historians think it was because Custer had contracted gonorrhea while at West Point, and that the mercury that he was given to get rid of the gonorrhea had left him unable to have children. Libby, though, loves him dearly. He loves her dearly. For a man of the 19th century, he seems to be the perfect husband, and yet we know that he has affairs. We know that he toys with Libby by trying to make her jealous. In letters while they are apart, he will write about all of the female attention he is getting and how tempted he is to be with another woman, but he would never do that to her. So he's this contradiction of loving husband, but shameless flirt at the same time. Custer's a contradiction in his idea of race relations. In no universe does he believe that African Americans are equal, and yet he employs an African American slave. Let me rephrase that. He employs a contraband. A young woman who had been a slave runs away during the Civil War and joins the Union Army as a contraband. Custer hires her as his cook. Her name is Eliza Brown, and she stays with the Custers long after the end of the Civil War. She is one of the few people who talks back to the general. She is the one who cares for Libby while Custer is out on campaign on the plains after the Civil War. She basically runs his household, and Custer defers his authority to Eliza. When Custer initially refuses to allow freedmen to eat out of the officers' mess when the contrabands come into camp, Eliza stands up to him and says, "That's not right. I'm your cook. I'm cooking for him." And that's that. And Custer lets her. So this man who believes that in no universe are blacks his equal allows this small young black woman to run his household and his life. In many ways, Custer is extremely kind-hearted. There are many, many stories of Custer on the battlefield during the Civil War, extending kindnesses to a vanquished foe, helping a wounded Confederate to get aid. Custer loves dogs, will pick up stray dogs, take them in, travels with dogs. You see a picture of Custer and his dog here in the middle. He loves dogs, and yet when he gets to Texas during Reconstruction and out to Fort Riley on the plains, he shows absolutely no mercy for the men in his command. He shoots deserters without court-martial or fair trial. He lashes them without fair trial, and he is seen as this ruthless tyrant. So he is this man of contradiction. And in his writings, both his autobiographical writings and his letters, you see him as this hopeless romantic at a time that romanticism is dying. He is the cavalier in the very last war that the cavalry plays a significant role. He is a flashy hero in an army that is supposed to be an equalizing force. He values individual achievement in a war that is characterized by masses of casualties. He is resistant to the very new industrialized culture that he has helped to usher in. So why do we love to hate him so much? We love to hate him so much because Custer's a reflection of us. When Custer dies on that battlefield in Montana in 1876, he is seen as a martyr for manifest destiny, which is the very policy of the United States government. He is a reflection of who the United States is and what it did during its formative years to become the nation that it is today. And so just as we always are harder on the people who are most like us because they are most like us than we are on people who are different, we love to hate Custer because he symbolizes such contradictions in American society. Now, of course, initially, Custer's myth was seen as heroic. I will say that part of the reason we love to hate Custer in the 21st century has more to do with the 21st century than it does with Custer. In the late 19th century, Custer was seen as a hero. People loved him. You'll see on the screen a picture, a black and white engraving right under the words changing perceptions. This is a graphic of Buffalo Bill Cody taking the first scalp for Custer. When word reaches Washington, D.C. of Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn on June 25th, 1876, it reaches D.C. just in time for the celebration of the nation's centennial on July 4th. Believe me, that irony is not lost on anyone. At the Philadelphia Exposition that is celebrating this industrialized nation and the progress that the United States has made in its first century of existence, the Philadelphia Exposition is showing off the telephone that Alexander Graham Bell has just demonstrated, the locomotive that can go across the country. It is celebrating all of these industrialized achievements. You have the best of the Union Army defeated by a culture with Stone Age weapons out in the West. If this does not challenge the United States' perception of itself at this seminal moment, nothing does. Immediately, Buffalo Bill, who always a showman, has to take back to the plains. Buffalo Bill had been in the East for the exhibition and to star in a show about his life. He goes back out on the plains, and at the Battle of Warbonnet Creek in July of 1876, July 17th, less than a month after Little Bighorn, he scalps the warrior Yellow Hair and calls it the first scalp for Custer. So that graphic you see on the screen is him holding up Yellow Hair's war bonnet and scalp, first scalp for Custer. Custer becomes this prophet, as I said, for manifest destiny. He's this Civil War hero who dies for our pursuit of westward expansion. And we like to believe he dies heroically. We will never know. We will never know because he was isolated. The bodies were found 2 days later by the rest of Custer's command. They had been maimed, mutilated, dragged by wild animals, in some cases dragged by the Indians themselves. But we like to believe that it was a heroic last stand. And to that end, the Anheuser-Busch Corporation released a poster of Custer's last stand that you see in the middle of the screen that has become the epitome of the iconography of Custer. Standing there, surrounded by Indians, all of his command dead except for him, his horses gone, being shot at from 360 degrees, but Custer, defiant, standing there with his sword overhead. We want to believe that of him because we want to believe that of us. We want to believe that that is how the United States would respond to her enemies. When the United States faces challenges, we want to believe that that is how we would be. And so through the first part of the 20th century, this is the story that is told of Custer. Not only people like Buffalo Bill and the Anheuser-Busch Corporation enhance that. Libby Custer never remarries. Although only in her early 30s when Custer dies, she becomes a professional widow. She writes books about their life on the plains, conveniently forgetting some of Custer's less heroic exploits and turning him into the Custer that becomes the myth. It is not until the 1950s, when a man named Evan Connell writes the book Son of the Morning Star, that we start to get any sort of negative depiction of Custer. Of course, in the 1960s, during the American Indian movement, Vine Deloria Jr. writes an Indian manifesto titled Custer Died for Your Sins, making Custer the symbol, or probably more appropriately, articulating the fact that Custer has always been the symbol for manifest destiny. And as we move into the latter part of the 20th century, the pendulum on Custer swings completely. You have Little Big Man. You have Cavalier and Buckskin by Bob Utley. These books show Custer as the villain. They downplay his Civil War exploits and play him totally as the villain. Until you come to the early part of the 21st century, where you get the books whose covers are pictured in the lower right, Custerology and Custer's Trials, that have a more balanced picture of Custer. And this is why I personally find Custer so fascinating. Custer is a deeply flawed, very human person. He is a man who had no self-awareness, who could not see his own contradictions. He could be kind, and he could be dastardly. He could be loving, and he could be hateful. He could be racist, and yet he could honor the individual regardless of their skin color. And in that, Doesn't that make George Armstrong Custer all of us?